Mom, we've decided to spend Christmas with Brad's family this year. His mother really needs us right now. The words hung in the air like icicles, sharp and cold, while my daughter Kimberly stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd taught her to make Christmas cookies, where we'd planned every holiday for 32 years, telling me I was no longer needed for the most important day of our family calendar. I should have seen it coming, really. The signs had been there for months, scattered like breadcrumbs through conversations that grew shorter, visits that became more obligatory, and that particular tone Kimberly had developed whenever she mentioned Brad's mom, with a reverence she'd never quite managed for her own mother. But standing there in my apron, flour still dusting my hands from the sugar cookies I'd been making for our traditional Christmas Eve gathering, I felt something crack inside my chest like thin ice under too much weight. "His mother needs you?" I repeated, my voice carefully level. "What exactly does Patricia need that's more important than our family tradition?" Kimberly shifted uncomfortably, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light streaming through the window I'd stood at every morning for 25 years, watching her catch the school bus, then later watching for her car when she'd come home from college. "She's been so lonely since Dad passed, and we think, it would mean the world to her if we spent Christmas there. You understand, don't you, Mom? You're so independent, so strong. You'll be fine on your own." The casual dismissal lodged in my throat like a fishbone. Independent. Strong. Code words I'd heard before, usually right before someone decided I didn't need the same consideration they'd give to anyone else. Patricia Morrison, Brad's mother, had been widowed for exactly 8 months. I'd been widowed for 3 years, but apparently my grief had an expiration date that hers hadn't reached yet. "What about our dinner? I've already ordered the turkey, planned the menu. Your brother Ethan is flying in from Seattle with the kids, specifically for our Christmas." The words came out more pleading than I'd intended, and I hated myself for it. "Oh, Ethan will understand. He's got his own family now. Maybe you two can do something simple. Just order takeout or something. It doesn't have to be a big production every year." Kimberly's voice had taken on that patient, slightly condescending tone that suggested my feelings were an inconvenience she was trying to manage efficiently. I turned back to the counter, focusing on cutting perfect star shapes from the cookie dough, while something dark and cold settled in my stomach. 28 years of Christmas mornings in this house, 28 years of staying up until midnight on Christmas Eve, arranging presents with mathematical precision under the tree, 28 years of her favorite stuffing recipe, of setting aside the wishbone for her, of Christmas morning coffee in the special red mugs her grandmother had left us. "Mom? You're not saying anything." Kimberly's voice carried the slightest edge of impatience now, as if my silence was holding up her schedule. I carefully placed another star on the baking sheet, my movements deliberate and controlled. "I'm just wondering when Patricia became your mother-in-law and I became the hired help who can be dismissed when more important family shows up." "That's not fair, Mom. That's not what this is about." But it was exactly what this was about, and we both knew it. Ever since Kimberly had married Brad 2 years ago, I'd watched myself being systematically replaced in her affections by a woman who treated her son like he was still 12 years old and expected the same deference from his wife. Patricia Morrison, with her perfectly appointed home and her careful manipulation disguised as neediness, had been maneuvering for this exact moment since the wedding. I'd seen it happening in small increments, the way Kimberly had started calling Patricia's house home when talking about holiday plans, the way she'd begun prefacing conversations with "Brad's mom thinks" or "Patricia says," the way she'd stopped asking my opinion on everything from furniture to career decisions, substituting Patricia's counsel for the mother who'd actually raised her. "Kimberly," I said quietly, not turning around, "do you remember the Christmas when you were 16 and convinced you were too old for the family dinner? You wanted to go to that party at Jennifer's house instead." "Mom, that's completely different. You told me family traditions were lame and that I was being controlling for expecting you to be here. Do you remember what I told you?" I could hear her shifting behind me, her heels clicking impatiently against my kitchen tiles. "Not really, no." "I told you that someday you'd understand that family isn't something you fit into your schedule when it's convenient, that the people who love you aren't backup plans for when your first choice falls through. That tradition matters because it's the thread that keeps a family woven together across time and distance and all the changes that try to pull us apart." I finally turned to face her, and what I saw in her expression, a mixture of guilt and defiance and something that looked almost like relief, told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in my daughter's life now. "You stayed for dinner that Christmas," I continued, "and afterwards you thanked me. You said you'd almost made a terrible mistake, that you could go to parties anytime, but you only got one family. Do you remember that part? Kimberly's jaw tightened. Mom, I was 16. This is different. I'm married now. I have responsibilities to Brad's family too. I can't just think about what you want anymore. The words hit like a slap, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't say. She didn't say she'd miss me. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't even pretend this was a difficult decision. I was simply being informed of a choice that had already been made, my feelings as irrelevant as if I were a restaurant she'd decided to skip. I walked to my kitchen window, the one that looked out over the backyard, where I'd pushed Kimberly on the swing set Ethan had built when she was 5, where we'd planted the garden that still bloomed every spring with her favorite flowers. The November afternoon light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the lawn that would be covered with snow by Christmas, snow I'd apparently be looking at alone. Tell me about Patricia's needs, I said, keeping my voice conversational. What exactly requires your presence so desperately that she can't share you for even part of the day? Kimberly brightened slightly, perhaps thinking she was making progress. Well, she's been so depressed since Dad passed. She barely leaves the house, barely eats. Brad is really worried about her. We thought if we made Christmas special for her, really showed her she's not alone, it might help bring her out of this dark place. I nodded thoughtfully, processing this information alongside what I knew about Patricia Morrison's recent activities. The Patricia who'd been barely leaving the house had been spotted at the country club's holiday luncheon just last week by my neighbor Margaret, who'd made a point of mentioning how radiant and social Patricia had seemed, holding court at a table full of her friends. The Patricia who barely ate had hosted a dinner party for 12 people 2 weeks ago, an event Kimberly had attended and posted photos of on social media, gushing about Patricia's amazing cooking and beautiful table settings. And you think abandoning your own mother on Christmas will accomplish this? How exactly? Mom, you're not abandoned. You're choosing to make this about you when it's about helping someone who's really struggling. Patricia doesn't have other children. Brad is all she has. We have to take care of her. The careful way Kimberly said we when talking about Patricia versus you when talking about me wasn't lost on me. Somehow, in the space of 2 years, I'd been moved from the inner circle of us to the outer ring of people who needed to understand and accommodate the real family's needs. What did Patricia say when you told her you'd be missing your own family's Christmas? I asked. Kimberly hesitated, and in that hesitation, I heard the answer she didn't want to give. She was so grateful. She started crying, actually. She said it meant everything to know that Brad had chosen such a caring, family-oriented wife, that she could tell I understood what really mattered. Family-oriented. The irony was so thick I could have carved it with a knife. And what did she say when you told her you'd invited me to join you all, since she understands the importance of family? Another hesitation, longer, this time. Mom, that's not really... it's going to be a small, intimate gathering. Patricia's she's not up for entertaining a lot of people right now. I turned from the window to look at my daughter directly. How many people will be at this small, intimate gathering? Well, there's me and Brad, of course, and Patricia, and Brad's Aunt Martha and Uncle Jim. They're driving down from Portland, and his cousin Kelly with her husband and their 2 kids. Oh, and Patricia's neighbor, Mrs. Owen. Patricia didn't want her to be alone for the holiday. Kimberly recited the guest list with the air of someone who hadn't quite grasped the mathematics of what she was saying. So let me understand this correctly. Patricia is too fragile to handle meeting your mother, but she's hosting Christmas dinner for 10 people, including 2 small children and a woman I assume she barely knows. Mrs. Owen isn't a stranger, she's a neighbor. And it's different, Mom. You can be a lot sometimes. Your personality, the way you take over situations. Patricia is very gentle, very quiet. She gets overwhelmed easily. I took over situations. My personality was a lot. After 32 years of motherhood, of putting my daughter's needs first in every situation, of managing every crisis and celebrating every triumph, I was now being characterized as some kind of overwhelming force that needed to be managed and contained. But what struck me most wasn't the casual cruelty of the assessment. It was how completely it echoed conversations I'd been overhearing for months. Kimberly on the phone with Brad, talking about how dramatic I could be, how I expected too much attention, how I didn't understand boundaries. These weren't Kimberly's words, they were Patricia's words, coming out of Kimberly's mouth like she'd been carefully coached in how to see her own mother as a problem to be solved. "When did you start thinking of me this way?" I asked quietly. "What way?" "As someone whose feelings don't matter, whose traditions are inconvenient, whose presence is something to be managed rather than enjoyed." Kimberly's face flushed, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the daughter I'd raised, the one who used to tell me everything, who used to seek my advice on every decision. But it passed quickly, replaced by the defensive mask she'd learned to wear when discussing anything that might conflict with her new family's preferences. "That's not true, Mom. I have to think about Brad too now, and his mother. I can't make every decision based on what makes you happy." "I'm not asking you to make every decision based on what makes me happy. I'm asking you to make one decision, just one, that takes my feelings into account at all." We stood there in my kitchen, the place where I'd bandaged her scraped knees and helped with homework and listened to endless stories about school friends and teenage heartbreak, and I realized that my daughter was looking at me like I was a stranger. Or worse, like I was an obligation she was tired of fulfilling. The timer for the oven went off, a sharp, insistent beeping that cut through the tension. I pulled the first batch of Christmas cookies from the oven, the stars perfectly golden, their edges crisp and their surfaces unmarked by the conversation that had just changed everything between us. "Mom, I need to go. Brad is waiting in the car, and we have dinner plans with Patricia." Kimberly moved toward the hallway, already reaching for her purse, already mentally gone from this conversation and this house and this relationship that had apparently become more burden than blessing. "Kimberly." She turned back and I saw her mother's eyes looking out of a face that belonged to someone I barely recognized. "When you were small, maybe 4 or 5, you used to have nightmares about being lost. Do you remember that?" She shook her head impatiently. "You'd wake up crying, convinced that you'd been separated from me in some crowded place and couldn't find your way back. And I'd hold you and tell you that no matter where you went, no matter how far away you traveled, you could always come home, that I would always be here, always be your mother, always have a place for you at my table." Kimberly's expression softened slightly. "Mom?" "I meant that then. I mean it now. But I need you to understand something, sweetheart. Being always available isn't the same thing as being always convenient. And being your mother doesn't mean I'm required to accept being treated as less important than everyone else in your life." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. "I hope you have a lovely Christmas with Patricia. I really do. I hope it's everything she needs it to be, everything Brad wants it to be, everything you think it should be. But I need you to know that when you walk out that door, you're not just skipping a dinner. You're choosing to tell your mother that she ranks below a woman you've known for 2 years when it comes to your loyalty and consideration." "That's not what this is about." Kimberly's voice rose, finally showing some emotion beyond patient condescension. "Then tell me what it is about. Explain to me how abandoning your family tradition to cater to a woman who can host 10 people but can't handle meeting me is about anything other than choosing her feelings over mine." Kimberly stood there, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find words that would make this all make sense. Words that would transform her cruelty into kindness, her abandonment into sacrifice, her betrayal into virtue. But there weren't any such words, and eventually she stopped trying to find them. "I have to go," she said finally. "We can talk about this later." "No," I said quietly. "We can't. Because later you'll want to smooth this over with promises about next year and explanations about how complicated this year was and assurances that this won't happen again. But it will happen again, Kimberly, because you've learned that my feelings are optional, that my needs are negotiable, that I'll always forgive you and always take you back and always make excuses for why you've chosen someone else over me." She stared at me, and I could see the exact moment when she realized I wasn't going to make this easy for her, wasn't going to be understanding about her choice to prioritize Patricia's wants over her own mother's feelings. "Fine, Chicayes," she said, and the word came out sharp and angry. "Be dramatic about this. Make it all about you, like you always do. But don't expect me to feel guilty for trying to help someone who actually needs it, instead of someone who just wants attention." The kitchen fell silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, the same clock that had marked time through every moment of her childhood, every homework session and heart-to-heart talk and quiet evening when it was just the two of us against the world. Kimberly walked out without saying goodbye, her heels clicking purposefully against the hardwood floors I'd refinished by hand when she was in high school, wanting everything to be perfect for the friends she brought home. I heard the front door close with a decisive snap, heard Brad's car start up and pull away from the curb, carrying my daughter away from me toward a family that had decided I wasn't worth including. I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the smell of Christmas cookies and the weight of 32 years of memories that had apparently meant less to my daughter than 2 years of marriage to a man whose mother collected children the way some people collected china, carefully, possessively, and with complete disregard for where they'd originally belonged. But as I stood there, something besides hurt began to simmer in my chest, something that felt less like sadness and more like steel, less like abandonment and more like awakening. Because Kimberly had made an assumption in her cruel dismissal, an assumption that would prove to be spectacularly wrong. She'd assumed I would spend Christmas alone, nursing my hurt and counting my losses. She'd assumed I would accept being relegated to the position of inconvenient obligation, the mother who was too much work to include in the real family celebrations. She'd assumed I had nowhere else to go and no one else who valued my company. She'd assumed I would stay exactly where she'd left me, available for when she decided my presence was convenient again. But I'd been making my own plans for months now, plans that Kimberly knew nothing about because she'd stopped asking about my life around the same time she'd started prioritizing Patricia's opinions over mine. Plans that involved people who actually enjoyed my company, who valued my traditions, who understood that being part of a family meant showing up even when it wasn't completely convenient. I walked to my desk in the living room and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Margaret Williams had been my friend for 20 years, and her son James had been asking me to coffee for the past 6 months, ever since his own divorce had finalized and left him looking for someone who understood the particular loneliness that comes after children grow up and move on. "Margaret, it's Ellen. I was wondering, is that Christmas invitation still open? The one James mentioned for your family gathering?" Margaret's warm laugh filled the phone. "Oh, honey, of course it is. James will be thrilled. He's been asking about you every week, wondering if you'd changed your mind. What made you decide to join us?" I looked around my living room at the Christmas tree I decorated by myself with ornaments collected over 3 decades of family celebrations, at the stockings hanging on the mantel with Kimberly's name still carefully embroidered in gold thread. I realized I have a choice to make about how I spend my holidays. I can sit here feeling sorry for myself, or I can celebrate with people who actually want me there. Well, we definitely want you there. James is making his famous prime rib, and I'm doing all the sides. Very low-key, just family and a few close friends. What can you bring? How about Christmas cookies? I just made several dozen stars, and I was thinking they might need a better home than my kitchen counter. Perfect. Christmas Eve at 6, Christmas Day at 2 for dinner. And Ellen? James is going to be over the moon. I hung up the phone and looked around my house with different eyes. Instead of a space that would echo with loneliness on Christmas morning, I saw a place where I could get ready for celebration with people who actually valued my presence. Instead of a kitchen where I'd cook for one, I saw a place where I could bake cookies for a family that would appreciate them. The irony wasn't lost on me that Kimberly's rejection had freed me to accept an invitation I'd been politely declining for months out of loyalty to family traditions that apparently meant more to me than they did to her. I spent the evening baking, making extra batches of every cookie recipe Kimberly had ever loved, packaging them in beautiful tins with ribbons and bows. Not for her, she'd made her choice about whose cooking mattered, but for James Williams, who'd mentioned more than once that he missed his ex-wife's baking, and for his mother Margaret, who'd been nothing but kind and welcoming in the years since I'd started attending her book club. As I worked, I thought about the phone call I'd make to Ethan in Seattle, explaining that Christmas plans had changed, and he was welcome to fly out anyway to meet my new friends, or to stay home with his own family and enjoy a pressure-free holiday. Unlike Kimberly, Ethan would understand that sometimes families fracture and shift and require new configurations, and that loving someone doesn't mean accepting being treated poorly by them. I thought about the turkey I'd ordered, which would be redirected to the food bank, where it could feed a family that would actually be grateful for it. I thought about the presents I'd bought for Kimberly and Brad, which would find their way to the local children's charity, making some other families' Christmas brighter. Most of all, I thought about Kimberly's face when she realized that her dismissal hadn't left me broken and alone, but had instead opened a door to relationships with people who understood that family isn't something you take for granted or treat as a backup plan. By the time I went to bed that night, I wasn't thinking about Christmas as something I'd have to endure alone. I was thinking about it as the first holiday of my new life, the first celebration where I'd be surrounded by people who chose to include me, rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. Christmas Eve arrived cold and bright, with snow falling in thick, perfect flakes that made everything look like a greeting card. I dressed carefully in the red wool dress Kimberly had once said made me look distinguished, paired with the pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's. If I was going to meet my new family, I wanted to look like someone worth knowing. The Williams house was warm and welcoming, filled with the sound of laughter and conversation that never once paused to accommodate someone's difficult personality or overwhelming needs. James met me at the door with a smile that made me remember what it felt like to be genuinely happy to see someone, and Margaret hugged me like I belonged there, like my presence added something valuable to their celebration rather than something that needed to be managed. "Ellen brought cookies," Margaret announced to the room, and I found myself surrounded by children and adults alike, all exclaiming over the beautiful tins and asking about recipes and making me feel like I'd brought treasure instead of simple sugar cookies. James took my coat and led me to the living room, where a fire crackled in the fireplace, and Christmas music played softly in the background. "I'm so glad you decided to join us," he said quietly. Christmas Eve hasn't felt this complete in years. I looked around the room at faces I was just beginning to know, people who'd opened their family celebration to include a woman whose own daughter had found her too inconvenient to include in hers. The contrast was so sharp it almost took my breath away. We spent the evening playing games and sharing stories, eating wonderful food, and enjoying the kind of easy companionship that doesn't require anyone to diminish themselves to make others comfortable. When James walked me home at the end of the night, snow crunching under our feet and the Christmas lights twinkling in windows all along our street, I realized I hadn't thought about Kimberly and Patricia's gathering once all evening. "Thank you," I told him as we reached my front porch. "I didn't realize how much I needed tonight until it was over." He smiled and touched my hand gently. "You know what I think? I think tomorrow is going to be even better. You're going to love Christmas dinner. Mom's been planning the menu for weeks, and she keeps asking what your favorite dishes are because she wants everything to be perfect for your first Christmas with us." First Christmas with us. The words wrapped around my heart like a warm blanket, filling up the space Kimberly's rejection had left behind. Christmas morning dawned bright and beautiful, and I woke up not to loneliness, but to anticipation. I had somewhere to go, people who wanted to see me, a family that had chosen to include me in their celebration. As I got ready for church, Margaret had invited me to attend Christmas service with them before dinner. My phone rang. Kimberly's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But curiosity won out over caution. "Merry Christmas, Mom." Kimberly's voice was carefully cheerful, the tone she used when she was trying to smooth over something unpleasant. "How are you doing? I know yesterday was difficult." "Yesterday was clarifying," I replied, keeping my voice pleasant but not warm. "How was your evening with Patricia and her 10 guests?" A pause. "It was fine. Good. Patricia was so happy to have everyone there. But Mom, I was thinking, maybe we could do something next week? Like a belated Christmas celebration, just us? I could come over and we could exchange gifts and have a nice dinner, just the two of us." I looked at myself in the mirror, adjusting the scarf Margaret had helped me choose yesterday when we'd gone shopping together for last-minute gifts. A woman who was wanted, who was valued, who had places to go, and people who enjoyed her company. "That's very generous of you, Kimberly, but I'm afraid I'm going to be quite busy over the next few weeks. I have plans." "Plans?" The surprise in her voice was unmistakable. "What kind of plans?" "The kind that involve people who include me in their celebrations, rather than treating me like an afterthought to be managed when convenient." I kept my voice level, matter of fact. "I've discovered that there are people who actually enjoy my personality, who don't find my traditions inconvenient, who value my company enough to plan around including me rather than planning around avoiding me." "Mom, that's not—" "Yesterday wasn't about avoiding you." "What was it about then, Kimberly? Explain to me how choosing to abandon your family tradition to accommodate a woman who can host 10 people but finds me overwhelming is about anything other than ranking my importance below hers." Silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that comes when someone realizes they've been caught in reasoning that doesn't actually make sense. "James Williams has invited me to spend New Year's Eve with his family," I continued conversationally. "We're going to that lovely restaurant downtown, the one with the jazz band. And Margaret and I are planning a trip to wine country in February. It seems my calendar is filling up quite nicely with people who appreciate my company." "James Williams, Margaret's son? Mom, are you dating him?" The shock in her voice was almost amusing. The idea that her mother might have a life beyond waiting around to be included in Kimberly's schedule had apparently never occurred to her. I'm having dinner with him tonight and tomorrow night and probably many nights after that. He's a lovely man who seems to genuinely enjoy spending time with me. Imagine that. But Mom, you can't just... we're your family. We need to work this out. You made a choice, Kimberly. You chose Patricia's comfort over your mother's feelings. You chose to treat our family tradition as disposable when something more appealing came along. You chose to characterize me as overwhelming and attention-seeking for wanting to be included in my own daughter's Christmas celebration. Those were your choices, and I've made mine. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, and I imagined her in Patricia's perfect house, surrounded by Patricia's perfect Christmas decorations, realizing that her mother wasn't going to be endlessly available to accept whatever scraps of attention she deigned to offer. This isn't how family works, Mom. You don't just replace people because you're upset with them. You're absolutely right, I agreed. That's not how family works. Family doesn't treat each other as disposable. Family doesn't rank each other's importance based on who makes fewer demands. Family doesn't abandon their own mother on Christmas to cater to someone else's preferences. But since you've decided those rules don't apply to you, they don't apply to me either. So what? You're just going to cut me out of your life? Over one Christmas? I'm not cutting you out, Kimberly. I'm simply treating you the way you've shown me I should be treated. As someone whose needs are optional, whose feelings are negotiable, whose presence is something to be fit into the schedule when nothing better is available. I heard what might have been a sob on the other end of the line, and for a moment my maternal instincts almost kicked in, almost made me soften my position and offer forgiveness she hadn't earned and acceptance she'd taken for granted. But then I thought about James, waiting to take me to Christmas service with his family. I thought about Margaret making room at her table for a woman whose own daughter had found her inconvenient. I thought about the warm welcome I'd received from people who barely knew me, contrasted with the casual dismissal I'd received from the daughter I'd spent 32 years loving and supporting. I have to go, Kimberly. I have a family waiting for me, one that actually wants me there. Merry Christmas. I hung up before she could respond and turned off my phone. Today was about celebration, about new beginnings, about discovering that being rejected by one family doesn't mean you're unworthy of love. It just means you're free to find a family that recognizes your worth. Church was beautiful, filled with candlelight and music that seemed to echo the peace I felt in my heart. Margaret introduced me to everyone as our dear friend Ellen, and James made sure I had everything I needed, holding doors and helping with my coat and generally treating me like someone whose comfort mattered. Christmas dinner was everything Kimberly's celebration wasn't, inclusive, joyful, and focused on making everyone feel valued and welcome. The conversation flowed easily, full of laughter and shared stories and genuine interest in each other's lives. When they brought out dessert, Margaret announced that Ellen had made the most wonderful Christmas cookies, and everyone applauded like I'd accomplished something remarkable. As I looked around the table at these people who'd welcomed me so warmly, who'd made room in their family celebration for a woman they barely knew simply because they enjoyed her company, I realized that Kimberly's rejection had been a gift of sorts. It had freed me from the prison of unconditional availability, from the exhausting work of loving someone who took that love for granted. Later that evening, as James and I sat by his mother's fireplace, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about everything and nothing, he reached over and took my hand. "I have something to confess," he said with a smile. "I've been hoping you'd have a change of heart about our family celebrations for months now. I just never imagined it would happen because your own family was foolish enough to take you for granted." I squeezed his hand and looked into eyes that held warmth instead of obligation, appreciation instead of tolerance. "Their loss," I said simply. "My gain." And for the first time in months, I meant it completely. 2 days later, my phone started ringing constantly. Kimberly, Brad, even Patricia herself, all wanting to smooth over what they were now characterizing as a misunderstanding that had gotten blown out of proportion. The word had apparently gotten back to them about my new social life, about the handsome widower who was taking me to dinner, about the family that had welcomed me with open arms. Suddenly, I wasn't too overwhelming or attention-seeking to be included in their plans. Suddenly, they were eager to work around my schedule, to make accommodations, to assure me that my feelings mattered deeply to all of them. But it was too late for that. I'd tasted what it felt like to be genuinely wanted, genuinely appreciated, genuinely included. I'd learned that there was a difference between being loved out of obligation and being loved out of choice, and I wasn't willing to settle for less anymore. When Kimberly called for the 15th time, I finally answered, "Mom, please, we need to talk this through. I've made a terrible mistake and I want to fix it. Please don't throw away our whole relationship over one bad decision." I sat in my living room, looking at the Christmas tree that had witnessed 32 years of family celebrations, considering my response carefully. "Kimberly," I said finally, "I want you to imagine something. Imagine you have a friend who consistently treats you as their last choice, who includes you in plans only when their preferred options fall through, who characterizes your personality as too much and your needs as inconvenient, who ranks your importance below people they've known for a fraction of the time they've known you. Would you continue to invest in that friendship?" That's not what I did." "That's exactly what you did. And the only reason you want to fix it now is because you've discovered I'm not going to sit here waiting patiently for you to need me again. You've discovered I have other options, other people who value my company, other places to spend my time and energy. But I love you, Mom. You're my mother." Love isn't just a feeling, Kimberly. It's a choice you make every day about how to treat someone, how to prioritize their needs, how to show them their importance in your life. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine. So what do I have to do? How do I fix this? I thought about that question for a long moment, looking around my house that no longer felt empty but felt peaceful, quiet in a way that spoke of contentment rather than loneliness. You start by understanding that some choices have consequences that can't be undone with an apology. You start by recognizing that taking someone for granted doesn't become acceptable just because you've been getting away with it for a long time. And you start by accepting that your mother is a person with feelings and needs and dignity, not a service provider who exists for your convenience. I understand that now. I do. I see how wrong I was. Do you? Because 3 days ago you saw nothing wrong with telling me I was too overwhelming to include in Christmas dinner while that same dinner included 10 other people. 3 days ago you saw nothing wrong with characterizing me as attention-seeking for wanting to maintain a 30-year family tradition. What's changed, Kimberly? My behavior or your perception of what my alternatives might be? The silence stretched long enough that I knew she understood exactly what had changed. "I have to go," I said gently. "James is taking me to the symphony tonight, and I don't want to be late." "Mom, wait. Kimberly, I want you to be happy. I truly do. I want your marriage to thrive and your relationship with Patricia to be everything you need it to be. But I also want you to understand that loving someone doesn't mean accepting being treated poorly by them. I've learned that lesson finally at 68 years old. I hope you learn it before you're my age." I hung up and turned off my phone again, then went to get ready for an evening with a man who'd never once suggested that my personality was too much or my needs were inconvenient. 6 months later, Kimberly filed for divorce. Apparently, Brad's devotion to his mother extended beyond Christmas dinner and into every major decision in their marriage, leaving Kimberly feeling like a third wheel in her own relationship. She called me, crying, wanting comfort and advice and support. I listened with the compassion I'd always had for her, but I didn't rush to fix her problems or offer to drop everything to help her through the crisis. Instead, I suggested she call Patricia, who'd been such a source of wisdom and support, who'd been worth abandoning her own mother for. By then, James and I were engaged, planning a small ceremony for the fall with Margaret's enthusiastic blessing and the warm welcome of his entire extended family. I'd found my place at their table, in their traditions, in their hearts, and I'd learned that sometimes the family you're born with isn't the family you're meant to grow old with. Kimberly eventually rebuilt her life, found her own apartment, started therapy to understand how she'd lost herself in trying to please a manipulative mother-in-law who'd never actually cared about her well-being. She learned, as I had learned, that being chosen should feel like a gift, not a burden. We have a relationship now, Kimberly and I, but it's different. It's built on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation, on appreciation rather than expectation. She no longer calls me when she needs something fixed or someone to blame for her disappointments. Instead, she calls when she has good news to share, when she wants advice she actually intends to take, when she misses the mother who raised her rather than needing the servant she tried to turn me into. James and I celebrated our first anniversary last month with a trip to Europe, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the chance when I was busy arranging my life around other people's schedules. We walked through villages older than our country, ate meals that lasted hours, talked about books and dreams and the future we're building together. Margaret has become the sister I never had, and James's children from his first marriage have welcomed me with the warmth their stepmother never received from my own daughter. At family gatherings, I'm introduced as James's wife, as someone who belongs, as someone whose presence adds to rather than detracts from the celebration. Sometimes late at night when I'm lying next to James listening to his steady breathing, I think about the woman I was before that Christmas Eve conversation in my kitchen. The woman who believed that being a good mother meant accepting whatever treatment her children felt like giving her. The woman who thought love meant never setting boundaries, never saying no, never expecting reciprocity. I think about how terrified that woman would have been at the idea of starting over at 68, of building a new family from scratch, of risking her heart on someone who might not choose her back. How she would have clung to the familiar pain of being taken for granted rather than reaching for the uncertain possibility of being genuinely valued. That woman died the day Kimberly walked out of my kitchen without saying goodbye, and in her place grew someone I like much better. Someone who knows the difference between love and obligation, between family and blood relation, between being needed and being wanted. Kimberly sends me Christmas cards now, beautiful ones with handwritten notes about how grateful she is for the lessons I taught her about dignity and self-worth. She's dating a kind man who treats her like she matters, who includes her in his family celebrations not because he has to, but because he wants to share his world with her. She understands now what I tried to teach her that awful December day, that being someone's mother doesn't make you their servant, and that loving someone doesn't require accepting being dismissed or disrespected or taken for granted. Last Christmas, James and I hosted both of our families at our new house, the one we bought together 6 months after we married. Kimberly came and she brought her new boyfriend, and she spent the evening helping in the kitchen and asking about family recipes, and generally behaving like someone who understood that being included in celebrations was a privilege, not a right. Patricia was not invited, of course. She'd burned that bridge when she orchestrated the systematic exclusion of her son's mother-in-law from family gatherings. I heard through the social network of our small town that she spent Christmas alone that year, having alienated most of her friends with the same manipulative behavior she'd used on Kimberly. Some people might call that cruel, but I call it natural consequences. When you teach someone that other people's feelings don't matter, eventually you discover that your own feelings don't matter either. As for me, I learned something invaluable that Christmas season, that it's never too late to start over, never too late to demand better treatment, never too late to discover that you're worthy of love that doesn't come with conditions or limitations or the constant threat of withdrawal. I learned that family isn't always the people you're born to, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone else's worst impulses toward you. Most importantly, I learned that the woman I'd been, accommodating, self-sacrificing, endlessly available, hadn't been virtuous. She'd been afraid of being alone, afraid of being unloved, afraid of discovering that she might not be as essential to other people's happiness as she'd convinced herself she was. The woman I became, boundaried, selective, protective of her own dignity, isn't selfish or demanding or attention-seeking, despite what Kimberly once called her. She's simply someone who learned, later than she should have but not too late to matter, that she deserved better than scraps of affection thrown her way when nothing more interesting was available. On quiet Sunday mornings now, James and I read the paper together over coffee, planning our week and discussing our dreams for the future. Margaret calls to invite us to dinner or to share gossip from book club. Kimberly texts to share photos of her new apartment or to ask for advice about a work situation. My calendar is full of people who choose to spend time with me, not people who feel obligated to fit me into their schedules. My phone rings with invitations, not demands. My table is surrounded by faces that light up when I walk into the room. It took me 68 years and one daughter's casual betrayal to learn that this was possible, that this was what I deserved, that this was what had been waiting for me all along if I'd only been brave enough to reach for it. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but they're wrong about that. You can learn at any age to demand better treatment. You can learn to walk away from people who take you for granted. You can learn that being alone is infinitely preferable to being tolerated. And if you're very lucky, as I was, you can learn that walking away from the wrong people creates space for the right people to find you. Christmas will be here again soon, and James and I are already planning our celebration. Margaret will make her famous stuffing, and I'll bake the cookies that everyone always raves about, and James will tell the story of how we met, how his mother kept trying to introduce us until I finally said yes to coffee. Kimberly will be there, and she'll help set the table and compliment the decorations, and generally behave like someone who understands what a gift it is to be included in someone else's family tradition. But this time, if she ever decided that someone else's celebration was more appealing, If she ever again decided that my feelings were less important than someone else's preferences, if she ever again suggested that my personality was too much or my needs were inconvenient, well, this time I know exactly what I would do. I would wish her well and mean it. I would hope she finds exactly what she's looking for. And then I would turn back to my chosen family, the people who see my worth and celebrate my presence and never, ever take for granted the love I offer them. Because I've learned finally and completely that being someone's mother or daughter or wife or friend is not a license for them to treat you poorly. Love is not an obligation to accept whatever someone feels like giving you. Family is not a trap that requires you to tolerate disrespect for the sake of keeping the peace. Real love, real family, real belonging feels like coming home. It feels like being seen and valued and celebrated for exactly who you are. It feels like safety and warmth, and the absolute certainty that your presence makes someone else's world a little bit brighter. I had spent so many years accepting less than that, convincing myself that scraps were sufficient, that being tolerated was the same as being treasured. But now I know better, and knowing better has made all the difference. The woman who baked Christmas cookies alone in her kitchen while her daughter chose another family over her own is gone. In her place stands someone stronger, wiser, happier, someone who learned that the most radical act of self-love is refusing to accept being treated as anything less than the treasure you are. And that, I've discovered, makes for the most beautiful Christmas miracle of all.